Okay. All right, so as I was saying, the scientific community has a set of standards for what you need to do when you're publishing research. And as part of that community, you'll be expected to follow these. Unfortunately, most people are either unaware of the rules, or there's a certain amount of vagueness involved in them that leads to lots of disagreements, frequent conflict within the community, and so on and so forth. So this is an attempt to give you an overview of what is involved with ethical behavior when publishing research and submitting grants and so on, and a sense of how to find out more information than I can present here. But these rules are necessarily fairly high level, and when you get into the actual specific situations involved in preparing a publication, sharing reagents, figure out who's authors, there's a lot of room for ambiguity. So a lot of these things get sorted out on a case-by-case basis. So this will be necessarily, it'll be hopefully a helpful background, but it won't necessarily tell you how to handle any given situation that you'll find yourself in later in your careers. And this is definitely something where anybody who has experience in the past or has questions should ask. So one of the biggest conflicts when it comes to publications is authorship, as in who belongs as an author of a paper or not. So who gets on the paper largely depends on who contributed work to it. But the question again is, what exactly constitutes work? So authorship is usually reserved for someone who either designed experiments, contributed experiments, or contributed any reagents that haven't already been described in a previous publication. That's the simplest way to view it. Once you have published a paper describing reagents, as we'll get into later, you're obligated to provide them to the larger community. So you may find politically it's better to include somebody who has contributed reagents, include them as an author on the paper, because they'll be happier to do something collaboratively, you'll have a better working relationship with them, and so on and so forth. But that's not an obligation, and again, that's something you may need to work out on a case-by-case basis. The order of authorship is also a frequent source of conflict. So, in general, the first author is viewed to be the person who did most of the work for the paper. Usually that's a graduate student or postdoc. And having a first author paper is more significant than being a middle author somewhere in a list of 20 especially. So if two people both worked hard on a single project, in a lot of cases there's opportunities for conflict between them when it comes down to who goes first. Lately there's been frequent cases where people actually put footnotes and say these two authors contributed equally to the work. Whether that overcomes this sort of historical bias of people like grant reviewers or hiring committees to view first author papers as more significant or not, I don't know. It'll probably vary by a case-to-case basis, but in a lot of cases, if what you're looking at is just an asterisk for the first two authors, nobody's going to look to see that the asterisk told them that the two authors contributed equally. So deciding who exactly contributed more work is, again, not cut and dry, and that's something you'll often have to negotiate both between you and the other author and you and your PI. Last author is usually reserved for the person whose lab most of the work was performed in, although, again, there are exceptions to that. Collaboration versus exchange of material. So this is something I hinted at earlier. There is no such thing as a formal collaboration. You often have just informal verbal agreements that you're going to collaborate with a different lab on a given project or a given question, and then it comes down to writing the paper, and you've got to decide, who from each lab gets on the paper, and all of a sudden you'll find out that there were different expectations about, what exactly was involved in the collaboration. There is no cut and dry way of handling this. Again, the simplest rule is that when you've got an exchange of unpublished material, it's a collaboration that requires authorship. If the material is already published, you don't. But there are also cases where there's intellectual contributions. So what you have in these, again, stop me if this is not making sense to people, but in many cases you might be pursuing experiments in a field you're not an expert in, and it's easiest in those cases to find a lab where somebody actually knows what they're doing, and you could either get them on the phone, exchange emails. I've even gone to Texas in the past to demonstrate a technique to one of our collaborators. And so in that case, you're providing a significant intellectual contribution to the work, even though you may not be necessarily performing the experiments yourself that wind up in the paper. And that may be justification for getting you an authorship on the paper. Again, this is something, for all of these, it's easiest to try at least to sort it out in advance. So try to make sure everybody knows exactly what's going on in terms of authorship. I did the lab in Texas I collaborated with. We agreed we'd split the results into two papers. That lab would get one first author, and the lab I was working in at the time would get one first author. And that worked out well. Both papers did get accepted. But there's always situations where you might find an agreement like that comes up short, where you got one of the papers accepted but the other didn't, in which case you might have to renegotiate. In general, though, making things clearer up front is usually better and smooths things over. The other thing is try to use as plain a language as possible to make sure there's no ambiguity. It's often easier when you're engaging in negotiations to phrase things as gently as possible because you think it'll go down more smoothly, but that just tends to lead to misunderstandings later if you don't clearly state up front who gets what out of a collaboration. The other thing is, if possible, have the PIs do the negotiation on this, especially as grad students and to a lesser degree as postdocs. You shouldn't be handling these sort of interactions between labs because it won't have the same consequence for your relationship with the field as it will for the PI, although you could easily offend somebody senior somewhere at a major institution and screw your own career up. So one of the things I noted on the last slide was the PNAS example, and that's Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, for those who don't know. And these sorts of things are much more common now. I think Nature allows it. So if you notice the third section, there are author contributions, and I didn't list the authors, but trust me, all those initials are people whose name is on the paper. And there you actually specify who did exactly what. So if somebody only designed research, such as, I believe, ACM, typically that'll be the PI involved in the lab who isn't actually doing research anymore. But that gives anyone reading the paper a much clearer understanding of what everybody's contribution was. So again, GFK got on the paper there because they contributed new reagents or analytical tools. So they didn't necessarily do any of the work that showed up, but that's somebody who got a publication because they shared something ahead of their own publication. Analyze data, again, that's a lesser contribution than performing the research. So, you sort of have some sense of what's going on. The other thing here, which is a little separate from authorship, but can be related, is the bottom line, which is the authors declare no conflicts of interest. In many cases, people publish research that is either related to drug development, especially in the biological field. It could be related to drug development. It could be related to things you're intending to patent, such as a technique or a reagent that may be widely useful in the field. And in that case, or it could involve who you're receiving funding from. So again, tobacco companies have funded research in the biological field, and people have done studies and shown that results published with that money actually tended to give a more positive spin on the health issues related to tobacco use. And so that raises, when you see tobacco money being involved, it raises red flags. In fact, somebody over at Cornell published studies with money that derived from a nonprofit foundation that was funded with tobacco money. So it was 3 steps removed, but in the end, the work was on early detection of lung cancer, and there was tobacco money behind it, and it eventually became public knowledge. So some journalists figured this out, and it showed up in the New York Times. So the conflict of interest statements can be, most labs don't even have a patent, will never patent anything in the course of their existence. A lot of people do basic research and never run across this, but once you wander into the medical field, or you're developing a technique you think could be widely useful and commercialized, such as a microscope attachment, color staining reaction, something like that, anything that could be patented and commercialized, you may run into a conflict of interest. And in that case, it's better to declare it up front than have it appear on the pages of the New York Times. So that's also something you have to worry about. And again, it's something you have to worry about in terms of all the authors on the paper, because you may not know who's got money from who. So definitely communicate with the authors. And that, I will emphasize this many times. That can be much harder than it might appear, because people tend to do a few experiments on their way out of the lab, leave it behind for somebody else to work on. And in one lab I worked in, somebody wound up in the Peace Corps in Ghana after she left the lab. And we were writing a paper with her on it, and it was a real challenge to make sure she was happy with everything. So, stay in communication with people you think you're going to be writing a paper with as best as possible. And this is something that should be obvious, but you'd be amazed at how often it doesn't happen. Everybody who is listed as an author on a paper should be happy with everything about the paper. In at least 3 cases, I received the final draft of a publication after it had already been submitted to the journal, and in one case I only got the final draft after it had been published, and my name was on all of these. So people are not as good about this as they could be. If any of the results in there, either, it's possible I'd know some of the results were misinterpreted. I'd have information from unpublished data elsewhere that could influence the interpretation, and I'd wind up having my name on a paper that I didn't agree with the conclusions of. And something else I published, in one case, the author actually asked to be taken off because he didn't agree with our interpretation and didn't feel he had contributed anything to developing the paper. So it's absolutely essential that everybody involved with the publication be happy with the contents of it before it goes into the journal. And it doesn't happen as often as it should. Is everybody good with this so far? Citations and considerations about the contents of your paper. The basic thing involved with citations is giving credit where it's due to other scientists in the community. And especially during the background section and the discussion section, you're going to be bringing up information that you yourself did not produce. And all research is built on previous results, so you really need to cite where the information is from. The problem is that in some cases, several labs publish a large series of papers with related results, and you could easily wind up with an introduction that has more text devoted to references than it does to actual information, and you do want to avoid that. There are two ways around this. The very, very simplest is to find a review on the topic. Basically, a review usually collects all the information from multiple citations for you in a single place, and so if you cite the review, by extension you are citing the original sources of the information. That's considered acceptable if somebody has reviewed the topic you're writing on. The other thing is to write as specifically as possible. So there may be 20 publications that say vaguely related things, but if you phrase a sentence so that you're only referring to the most relative aspects of that information, then you can cut down on the list of references you provide. But it is really important, to the best of your ability, to cite someone who has produced relevant research, because you never know when the person you didn't cite will wind up reviewing one of your papers or grants in the future. And people hold grudges over this. They want to see their work recognized, and if you continuously ignore them, they will notice, and it will cause you problems. It may not be serious, but it's something you should avoid if at all possible. The other thing is, whose ideas do you consider? So in many cases where there's controversial topics, there may be multiple competing models to explain a given phenomenon. There may be sort of two camps that are, in as far as these things go, at war with each other over which interpretation is right. It's always best to, if possible, discuss and cite all models that are relevant and seem to be in play, in that there's not data that conclusively demonstrates they're wrong. So that's something that will often come up in either the introduction or discussion again, where you have to describe the intellectual background that your work fits into. And it's really important as a form of ethical behavior that you don't just ignore a potentially valid interpretation of scientific results. It sounds obvious when phrased that way, but when you're writing the paper and you think, well, I really don't believe these guys who say this, and you're tempted to ignore them, it's better not to. If there is controversy over the result, list it, discuss it, and just explain why your data supports your model rather than pretending the other one doesn't exist. And related to this is the issue of alternate interpretations. So this is not a citation issue per se, but in many cases your data may sort of have you leaning towards one interpretation or another, and I have known people who have just basically decided to ignore the fact that there might be alternate interpretations for the same data. And it's very easy when you're the one doing the work and looking at the samples day in and day out to get an impression of how the system operates that's hard to quantify. Does that make sense? So you have a sense of how a given phenomenon occurs, but you don't have data that clearly provides evidence for your sense of things. And it gets very easy in that case to write as if you've got concrete evidence for that, or to ignore other possibilities. And it's something that should be avoided. It's, If you can't demonstrate it conclusively through data, then you need to consider as an ethical behavior, you need to consider the alternate possibilities. Because otherwise you're giving a distorted view of the science you've produced. Plagiarism. This is getting to be both a larger problem, considering it's so easy to copy and paste information and text from other sources, but at the same time, because of things like Google, it's becoming much, much easier to detect. How many of you know what plagiarism is? Okay, so everybody's pretty much come across it. Whoops. Okay, well, we'll start with one. One of the things that is more common with people who do not speak English as their primary language, they know what they're trying to say, they've seen it in other papers, and they feel that the writing in the other paper is very good, so they just use that phrasing. That is not okay. You need to phrase things distinctly from other sources. You can't just copy and paste. If you are going to use anything more than, I'd say, 5 contiguous words from another source, you should be quoting it. And in general, how many of you have ever seen direct quotes in a scientific paper? Doesn't happen. So if you are getting tempted to do that, you should basically not. Figure out how to rephrase it. In any case, if you are finding yourself on the verge of running up to that five-word limit, which is just a rough guide, that means you are almost certainly borrowing concepts from the other publication, and in that case you need to cite it. So it's just a good rule of thumb if you are looking at a publication and thinking that's what I want to say, that's where a citation goes, because you're taking information directly from another author. All right, ORI is the Office of Research Integrity. We'll get back to them later, but they're sort of the police of the scientific ethics, and they consider plagiarism much more broadly than the typical definition that you get from writing. It's both unattributed textual copying, which is a standard definition, but misappropriation of intellectual property. So that's defined below. Theft or misappropriation of intellectual property, unauthorized use of ideas or methods obtained by a privileged communication such as a grant or manuscript review. So basically, if you get high enough into the scientific food chain, you'll find yourself being invited to review papers, review grants, and as such, you get access to unpublished information from other labs. Typically, you get asked to do these things because you're an expert in the field, which, as a result, means you're competing with the other lab out there. If you're collaborating with them, then you should be recusing yourself from reviewing anything by them. Again, as ethical behavior, you shouldn't engage in a reviewing process if you have a potential for bias there. Anyway, as part of that reviewing process, what you may find is information about a technique you hadn't thought of, the availability of reagents you weren't aware of, data that may not be published but may influence your future experimental plans. It is not ethical to use data that you get data or information you get access to through these sorts of means. You are supposed to be doing this anonymously. It is supposed to sort of remain in a box separate from your day-to-day lab activities. The field is rife with indications that people do not obey these rules, so there's lots of instances where somebody has a publication that gets held up during review until a competitor has a chance to publish at the same time. Things like that do happen. It's very hard to demonstrate. You'll be hearing about them as you go along. So, nobody knows exactly what goes on in the editorial rooms of the major journals except the editors themselves. And these sorts of things do happen. But, ideally, you should avoid partaking in them yourself. Data fabrication or manipulation. This is, again, seems like a no-brainer. Don't do it, which I think is my first point, yes. So, it's obvious you shouldn't be doing this. Nobody should be, certainly you shouldn't be faking data, either making it up or taking data from a different experiment that doesn't, and presenting it as something it's not. But there's a large gray area when you've got a gel that doesn't look quite right and you're adjusting the contrast, or immunofluorescence where for whatever reason half the slide came out at a different brightness than the other. There's lots of visual data issues. There is also the issue of, if you have sections from 22 samples, which do you put in the paper? The one that is most typical or the one that best makes your case, and things like that. So basically, ignore that for a moment. On my laptop, I get to see what's coming up next, so I'm better at this. So if this seems jumpy today, it's because I'm not using my laptop and I have no idea what's next. Well, not no idea, but anyway, getting back to the main point, there's lots of ways that, although you're not overtly manipulating or fabricating data, to let bias creep into your presentation of it. And it's impossible to avoid. We all hope that our data backs our favorite model, because we tend to get emotionally attached to these things. So the best advice I have for you is to remain aware of the potential for bias and just try to see if you are exhibiting any indications that you are allowing your bias to influence the data you are presenting in a publication. Excuse me. Okay, so assuming you're an ethical individual and don't engage in data fabrication, the thing you really have to worry about is actually getting accused of it, and especially when not having done it. So the most important thing to do to avoid any potential for this sort of thing to cause problems is to document everything you do. I don't know about you, but I had an awful habit of falling a few weeks behind in my lab notebook and then rushing to catch up. And there have actually been cases where the FBI did ink analysis of somebody's notebook in a search for fraud. This happened in the David Baltimore case. Are any of you aware of that? God, I'm old. So this was a high-profile case. Nobel laureate, I think he was president of MIT at the time, and somebody accused his collaborator of engaging in fraud. And basically it reached the point where there were congressional hearings about it, and the FBI was called in to go through the collaborator's lab notebook and found discrepancies between the ink on different days and things like that. So chances are overwhelming this will never happen to you, but the less you have to, catch up on your lab notebook a month later, the far, far better shape you're going to be in. The other thing is always keep all original data. That is, it's getting easier to fall behind on this. You may have a, ancient, well, again, I may be being too old, but how many of you remember zip disks? Hey, two. They were 100 megabytes large. They existed. They were rewritable. They existed in the days before burnable CDs were convenient. And people put lots of data on them from their old experiments, and then eventually the hardware failed and they threw it out, and now all that data is essentially evaporated. So if somebody has questions about past results, you effectively cannot protect yourself from that if you are not good about keeping the original data around in a readable format. The other thing is, and I interviewed somebody once who had a postdoc in his lab who fabricated data by taking pictures of samples and then relabeling what they were and taking multiple shots of the same embryo and presenting them as different. And what he's instituted is a situation where as soon as an image is taken by his microscope, it actually makes the operating system itself, or a background process, makes a copy of that data on a read-only partition. So the second the image is taken, it's permanently stored where nobody can manipulate it. And that's just, that's somebody who's been burned by data manipulation, and that's his take on what you have to do to protect yourself from accusations of this. Again, you may not want to go this far, but these are things you'll have to consider, especially once you start running your own labs. And you're at the point where you'll probably be working in several labs over the next couple of years, and everyone will have different standards of data protection. Some of them won't take it seriously, and you might want to be the person to, twist some arms, because chances are good you won't do anything high enough profile or, questionable enough to catch anybody's attention. But if on the off chance you do wind up being a person who runs into trouble, you want to make sure you have all the original data, all the contemporary notes involved in describing how you got it. Image manipulation. Oh, this flowed badly. It looked beautifully on my laptop. So image manipulation is becoming an increasing issue. I think I discussed it earlier. What is it acceptable to do? Chances are many of you know more about what Photoshop can do than your PI will. There is a generation gap there. It was much worse when I was going through grad school and the PIs had never used Photoshop in their life. So you really have to have some sense of what's acceptable, because your PI may not even know what you can possibly do. One of the better, more progressive places about handling image manipulation is Rockefeller University Press, just a few blocks away, which has an official policy on what you can do. It's on their website, where it will also be nicely formatted. And I've got a link down there. It should show up on the handout. But basically, if you're going to do any brightness or contrast enhancements, which are called linear enhancements because all aspects of the image are treated in an equal manner, you have to do that to all aspects of the image. You can't just do it to one corner of it that you really want to bring out some nice data from. If you cut down gels to just show individual bands, you have to make a clear, visible distinction between, one lane and the next one over, so that it doesn't look like you're portraying two gels as a single run, so that your readers can be aware of it. Nonlinear adjustments, which are things like adjusting the gamma of an image. I don't know if any of you know what that is, but that treats different pixels differently depending on how much what information is there to start with. You have to disclose you're doing that if you're going to publish in Rockefeller. And Rockefeller is one of the few journals that will also actually take the images you submit and run forensic tools on them in Photoshop before they accept them for publication. And if they find something, your paper is held up until they sort out why their tools are showing something flaky about your image. So Other journals, like Nature, for example, has a very similar policy, but they don't do anything to enforce it. So, this is what they want you to do, but they're not going to check your images for you. Personally, I don't see, you pay the journal publication fees, and you pay them subscription fees to have access to it later. I personally don't see any excuse for them not doing this, especially when it can be automated. Reagent sharing we got into before. This, again, is Journal of Cell Biology, which is Rockefeller University Press. Free exchange of all clones, cell lines, and reagents used in studies published in this journal. Basically, if you publish something and somebody asks for it, it's often tempting not to give your competitors the antibody you worked 6 months to produce and bled countless rabbits to obtain. But if you publish it, you have to share it. And most journals have this policy. The NIH has that policy for any work done with its money. In general, once it's published, it's shared. That's sort of the flip side of the authorship issue. Again, if you share it willingly and say, I'd happily help explain how best to use it, maybe you'll get an authorship out of it. But at the minimum, you put it in the mail and tell people how to use it. And that goes for DNA, antibodies, anything of that sort. The other thing down at the bottom is nucleic acid protein sequences, microarray data, etc., must be deposited in a public database. And by that, typically you're talking about the NCBI, National Center for Biotechnology Information. They run GenBank, they run they run a protein database, I forget what it's called, things like that. There are other public repositories for DNA chip data. Basically, when you publish it, most places demand that you already have submitted the sequence to GenBank and provide them an accession number. And that's, again, goes into the sharing issue. These days, the NIH requires that within 1 year of publication, any results generated through NIH funding, you have to provide the Word document and figures that were the final copy of your paper. Some journals, Nature for example, does this automatically. 6 months after it's published, they send the PDF of the article onto the NIH for display. Others do it very reluctantly. There are some publishers who are seeking to have the policy overturned in Congress, but for now, it's literally law that if you have NIH funding, you have to submit all your publications generated by that to the NIH, and there's a whole system for doing that. This is something that is an NIH policy. If you are generating a transgenic or knockout mouse or something else from NIH money, you actually, as part of the grant, have to submit a plan for sharing that mouse strain with the biological community. This could be as easy as freezing fertilized embryos and shipping them to Jackson Labs, which is a major commercial entity that sells mouse strains. But the NIH needs to know about it. So that's, if you want to get NIH funding for a mouse project, this is a step beyond your standard reagent sharing. Oh, oops. All right, I said earlier that the Office of Research Integrity is sort of the police force when it comes to ethical behavior. And the website is really easy to find. You Google Office of Research Integrity, it's obviously the first hit you get. And they have both lists of policy, they have tools for detecting plagiarism and falsely manipulated images, and they also perform all the investigations determine sanctions, and publish what they are. So I really, really can't highly recommend enough that you go to this site and browse it and see what sort of things are going on in terms of research integrity. It's a great resource, and given that most of you will not have a class beyond this that discusses ethical behavior in research, it's really, really worth looking over. So, well, backing up, if you look down at the bottom over there, it's got misconduct, a misconduct section, which gets all of these misconduct findings in a single location. And that, I've copied one here, basically because I thought it was an interesting case where this MD was involved in a sleep study with money from the NIH and various other places. You can see there's a large collection of research support that was involved in this. A paper was published out of it, as you can see here, and then if you look in the bottom, you can see exactly how much data this guy fabricated. So he made up half of the data, fabricated completely a bunch of the anatomical data. He changed most of the remainder of it. Basically, this guy, the paper didn't exist. The data the paper was based on wasn't there, and there was an investigation. He got caught, and these are the sanctions. So again, this is formatted really poorly on this screen, but basically he cannot do any form of consulting for the National Institutes of Health or any other department within the Health and Human Services. Any institution that hires him for the next 3 years has to submit a written plan to the Health and Human Services explaining how they will carefully supervise him and prevent him from ever doing this again. And any publication that gets submitted from his work has to go through a special vetting process. Basically, this guy's career is over, because any institution that would hire him has to be notified of all these conditions, and there are always more qualified individuals to hire than jobs. So if you go wrong, and this guy went really, really wrong, this is the sort of thing you've got to deal with. And you can see a whole list of many issues. Many cases are far less egregious. There's like one figure where somebody did something flaky, but in general, what it means is that any institution you go to next will be, one, able to Google you and find this report from the ORI, and two, in many cases the sanctions involve notifying the institution and you just won't get the job. So it's an effective deterrent. So I also said that there are examples on the site, and this I actually needed my laptop for. I was going to do a demo. So this is, sorry about this. I didn't think about it. If you look carefully, the band up at 67, row that's labeled 67, is identical to this one. It may not be obvious looking at it because they're slightly off center relative to where it was cut and things like that. And it's, they're all big black smudges, so it's hard to tell visually. Basically you can import this image into Photoshop. This is something the ORI provides. And there are several actions, which are automated things, which will give this false color and bring up smaller details. And you could actually see there's a faint little thing sort of hanging off the right. As soon as you run this droplet, that turns into a big red stalk. And you can obviously see it's in both those lanes. And so, it's easy to make something that looks reasonable like this in Photoshop, but if it's easy to make it, it's easy to detect it with these things. This is something called ET Blast, which is, do you know what BLAST is for detecting sequence similarities? This thing, you can take any text you want, plug it into that, and it will use the BLAST algorithm to search for similar text in PubMed, which indexes every single abstract ever produced by most biomedical journals. There are other tools available and also professional plagiarism detection services now, but this one's free and it's on the web, and the research to develop it was funded by the Office of Research Integrity. So, as it's getting easier to commit misconduct on the electronics level, it's also getting much easier to detect it, and the Office of Research Integrity is fairly sophisticated about what they're doing, and they provide tools. Hopefully, that should not serve as a warning for you that you shouldn't be doing this, because you will get caught, but it should serve as a resource for you should you ever have concerns about somebody, you're employing or somebody you're working with that's behaving you suspect is behaving in an unethical manner. So the guy I was talking about, who I interviewed about the postdoc in his lab that committed fraudulent data, then went back and found out his past lab had issues with him and things like that, and there was one paper that was retracted after he left. So if, I wouldn't say that the fraud could have been prevented necessarily, but there were some indications that you should look more carefully about who you're hiring. I know of another case where somebody who was reviewing a grant came across a passage that looked familiar and did a search with this tool and found out it was from one of her own papers. So, yeah, and this was for a grant, and why fund somebody who's being unethical? So these tools are out there. Oh yeah, her paper wasn't cited either. These tools are out there and they're free, so take advantage of them if you wind up in situations where you think you need them. So that's it for me today. What I would like, so I will set up probably Monday and Tuesday, maybe full days, to sit in an office and be